Hello again. Welcome to episode 2 of Beyond a Reasonable Stout. I'm Jonathan Nobles. I have been an attorney for the last several years. And if you're not familiar with the program, what we do here is we talk about two things that are very, very important to me. One is critiquing government systems, and the other one is enjoying really good craft beer. And so, what we do is each episode, we take a particular style of beer and we use it as a metaphor for a particular system. And we look at it through the lens of the beer. And if that doesn't make any sense right now, just hang with us and you'll understand what we're talking about. There are some places that just feel heavy before anything happens. Think about courtrooms or police stations or prisons. You hear sirens, you see locked doors. The gravity of the situation arrives before the explanation. Before you know what's going on, you just know that it feels heavy. And so that's why this week we're going to be looking at heaviness through the metaphor of possibly the heaviest beer out there. This is the stout. And if you're not familiar with stouts just really do have that heavy feel. They're dark, as you can see. They're meant to be drinking slow. This is not a beer that you drink to be refreshed. This is a beer that you drink because you enjoy it, because maybe it's something that, in a kind of a weird way, comforts you, even though it's a taste that you kind of have to acquire if you're into acquiring taste. But I kind of like to call it's the protein shake or the smoothie of the beer world. There are actually breakfast stout variations. And while I'm not recommending that you drink these for breakfast, if you want your day to be productive in any way, shape, or form, the idea is this isn't just a light beer that, you drink one or two and you go about your day. No, this is going to stay with you. So this is the kind of thing that going in, it's dark, it's heavy, but there's a certain weird comfort in that. And like a lot of beers that, frankly, I enjoy, and I will be honest, I really like a good stout when I'm in the mood for it. There isn't a lot of middle ground with this one. People either love them or they hate them. And again, it's kind of an acquired taste. Fun fact as to where they come from, like a lot of really good beer, these come from 18th century England. And they're actually a variation of another style of beer that we might talk about more in a later episode, and that's the porter. And the reason they were called porters is because they were brewed and mainly consumed by street porters in England, the guys carrying stuff around, the working class. So this is really just kind of a solid working class beer, but it's something that really kind of fills you up and it stays with you. It's just heavy. And that's why it is a really good metaphor for the criminal justice system we have in the US. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So to start with, let's kind of review some of the mechanics of the criminal justice system. I mean, honestly, if you've seen police procedurals or courtroom procedurals, which I'm sure just about everybody has, you have a good idea because, yes, we know that TV isn't real life. Trust me, I know. But at the same time, trust. Sorry.
I wasn't trying to interrupt.
No, I get it. I got to stop. Yeah.
Okay, well, because it's connected to the mic, so you're going to
Yeah.
get vibrations.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So TV is not real life. We understand that. However, for the most part, especially depending on what you're watching, they try to be somewhat accurate. So you probably already have a pretty good idea of how these things go. First, there's a crime that's committed. And by the way, we probably need to draw a or kind of differentiate between crimes and civil actions. And again, we're getting really basic, but I just want to make sure everybody understands. Yeah, we have a system of laws. And that's the reason we had this system to begin with, is because we have a system of laws that says, okay, I have rights, you have rights. My rights end where your rights begin. So I have the freedom to live my life, do my thing. I have the right to not live in fear, but at the same time, so do you. So if I infringe upon your rights for whatever reason, then that means that there is a penalty for that, just so that we're all protected. And that's just the way our society works. There are some laws where essentially, if I do something to you, for example, It's you can take action against me. You can sue me. You can basically, yeah, you can bring a lawsuit. The state doesn't get involved. It's essentially you against me. So a crime hasn't been committed, but I've done something. Maybe I violated a contract, for example, and so you have legal recourse. But there are some actions where the state says, you know what, we really don't care what the other person thinks about what you did or didn't do. They may be fine with it, but we have an interest in making sure that this type of action doesn't go unchecked. So when it comes to things like violent crimes, murders, theft, so crimes against property, basically, when you look at the basic rights we have, life, liberty, and property, any of those that get violated, the state has a vested interest in making sure that doesn't happen. So you can forgive someone for robbing you, but the state can still say, you know what, you committed an act that needs to be addressed regardless of what the other person says. So that's really what a crime is. That's where the state gets involved and says, okay, you've got to answer for this. So a crime is committed as opposed to just a civil infraction. So crime's committed. There's an investigation, unless it's done right in front of a police officer or someone else in authority. They have to figure out what's going on. And then hopefully that leads to an arrest. And then once that person is arrested, they're formally charged. A lot of times there's actually, depending on the level of the crime, there may be a formal indictment through a grand jury. And then that person pleads to the crime. They can say, okay, yeah, I did it. Or they can say, no, I didn't do it. And here in the US, you have the right to not incriminate yourself. And you can say, okay, yeah, either I didn't do it, or you can basically say, okay, you've got to prove that I did it. And then ultimately, if you are convicted at trial, then you are sentenced. And sentences can range from incarceration to fines to probation, any number of things. But yeah, that's basically how things work. And most of us are familiar with that. What you may not know, if you haven't really been involved with it, is that in most scenarios, these end with pleas and not trials. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, a person who is accused of a crime, assuming there's enough evidence to reasonably convict them. If they're charged with a crime, most of the time they're going to plead guilty because there's an incentive on everybody's side for these not to go to court. For one thing, it saves taxpayer money for there not to be a trial. So the state is incentivized to try to make a deal with someone who's accused of a crime, and they may offer you a lesser sentence. It's like, hey, if you go to trial and you're convicted, you might spend 3 years in jail. We'll knock that down to an 18-month suspended sentence with 3 years probation if you just admit to it and just tell us you did it. So that most of the time that happens. And of course, then that also becomes a win for the person that's accused, because it's like, okay, if I don't feel like I have a reasonable chance of winning, I can agree to something that carries a lesser penalty. And that way everybody wins. Side note, and this is nothing about this, by the way, should be construed as official legal advice. I am not your attorney, whoever you are out there, unless we've signed something and you're watching. So this is just kind of a hypothetical. If I were you, let's just say that you were stopped and you got a traffic ticket. The state has an incentive for you to do what the form says and just sign it, send in a check, pay the fee. You don't have to go to court. Hey, no big deal, right? But chances are, if you actually go and talk to the prosecutor on your court date, there is a really good chance that they'll knock that down to something lower than what you're actually being accused of. So the bottom line is, if I got a traffic ticket, I would absolutely go to court before I agreed to pay or sign anything. And that's just in your best interest, or it would be in my best interest. So, but most of the time, everybody wants to see these things get pled out. But here's the problem with that is plea bargaining kind of becomes the norm. And sometimes people feel like they should plead to something whether they actually did it or not. There is this prevailing sentiment among some that if a person is arrested, there must be enough evidence there, and they probably did it anyway, so they might as well just admit to it. Save us all some money, and they can pay the penalty for whatever it is they did. Problem with that is people get arrested all the time, didn't actually do what they're being accused of. And that may not be nefarious. We're not even talking about police misconduct or anything like that, although that might exist, but that's not what we're really talking about. We're just talking about there are times when it's just easier to arrest this person because maybe they were in the vicinity, maybe they fit a description, maybe they happen to have some connection to the victim, and it just, there's enough there for them to be charged with this crime. And once they're in the system, that's when this heaviness sets in that we're talking about, because you get arrested for something, especially if maybe you can't afford a good attorney to fight it. Now, if you are arrested for something where there's even the remote possibility that you might end up going to jail or going to prison, you do have the right to court-appointed counsel. So that part's good. However, public defenders do a wonderful job, by the way. I absolutely have the utmost respect for public defenders, but public defenders are like a lot of other people. They're overworked and they don't necessarily have the capacity to devote the kind of attention to every case that they need to. So people understand that, okay, I could go with the public defender, or I could represent myself. That can present all kinds of problems because then you don't necessarily know what you're doing. Or if you have the resources, you can hire an attorney, but then what if you don't have those kind of resources? Well, then you're stuck with one of the first two options, which again, public defender, it's not a bad option. It's just you are running the risk of becoming just another file on somebody's already overcrowded desk, and you don't get what you need. Meanwhile, you've got a prosecutor and the police that are trying to convince you, well, just admit to it. Just admit to it. We'll give you this. We've got all this stuff against you. So if you just admit to it, we'll make sure that this goes easy on you, as opposed to you going to trial and then you'll probably lose. At least that's what they're telling you. So you kind of get in this mindset of, you know what, I might as well admit to it whether I did it or not. Another factor, because we were talking about resources. Let's say, for example, that you are the only breadwinner in your home. Well, now you are arrested. You're being held because you can't afford, and we haven't even started talking about cash bail. And I'll just kind of throw this in. Typically, if you're arrested, you end up going to jail. Hopefully a judge or a magistrate sets a bond, and then, which basically means you can pay some money to get out. But if you can't afford that, then you're stuck there. And that means that you're sitting in a jail cell, you're not working, your family's not being provided for. And so there's all this pressure on you to, let's just get this over with. I'll plead to something. I'll serve a sentence. I'll pay whatever fine I have to so that I can get out there and start supporting my family again. So there's all this pressure that is put on people. And yes, some people are guilty. I am definitely not one of these people that is going to make a blanket statement and say that all cops are bad. Everybody who gets arrested is being arrested under false pretenses. It's nefarious. No, there are a lot of people who get arrested and they deserve what they get. But we do live in a system where if the system is functioning properly, you have the right to face your accusers. You have the right to present evidence, and you have the right to challenge the fact that you've been arrested for something that you may or may not have done. And that's really important. But the problem with this heavy system is that it just kind of folds in on itself. And I think sometimes there are people who just feel like there's no reason to try because they just can't win. So they end up making deals that really aren't in their best interest. And yes, there is the option to plead no contest to something, but that really doesn't change. That doesn't change the penalty. That basically just says that it's a formal way of saying exactly what we're saying. Look, I didn't do this. Um, I'm not admitting that I did this, but I realize that it's hopeless to fight it. So I'm just going to take whatever you're offering me. So you have a lot of people that get stuck in there. And yes, that seems like efficiency, but what's the human cost? And that's really what we end up kind of looking like. Um, Another factor here is once a person either pleads guilty to something or they're convicted, then they have to be sentenced to something. And that can be incarceration, that can be a fine, that can be probation, that can be some combination of all of those. And especially when we talk about incarceration, we kind of have to look at what is the purpose for actually putting people in jail or putting people in prison. And that may seem like a weird statement. You know, of course, we put people in jail because they did bad things and they need to be there. Well, we've already discussed that there are people in jail that didn't necessarily do bad things. However, let's just put that aside for a moment and say, okay, let's talk about the people who really did commit crimes. They were either justly convicted or they pleaded to something appropriately, and now they're being sentenced. So let's say that sentence involves some prison time. Well, why are we actually doing that? And I'm not saying whether we should or shouldn't. I just think we need to think about why we're actually locking people up to begin with. And there are basically three theories, if you will, as to why we should or shouldn't be incarcerating people. We incarcerate people to punish. There are some that say, look, you did the crime, you do the time. You need to be punished for what you did. And that's one theory. Then we have people who say, okay, well, it's about deterrence, because if this person goes to jail, goes to prison for something, then other people should see that and say, hey, I don't want to end up in the same place, so I'm not going to do that. I'll think twice. Then there's rehabilitation. It's like, okay, we incarcerate people, and while they're there, we're going to work with them to try to help them better themselves so that when they come out, they're not doing that again. And there is some validity to all of those. And again, I'm not telling you necessarily how to think about that, but it is something to think about. We have all of these people in prison. Why are they there? And is it a good idea for them to be there? And more importantly, is putting people in prison, is it accomplishing whatever those goals are? And frankly, if you think the goal should be punishment, that one's kind of a no-brainer. They're being punished. If you think that it's about deterrence or rehabilitation, then you have to start looking at what we call recidivism. People are arrested, people serve sentences, they get out. What happens at that point? And the stats are showing that about 68% of people who are released from state prisons are rearrested within 3 years. And then within 9 years, that figure rises above 80%. And nearly half of those people are rearrested within the first year. And then if you look at the federal system, about half of people who are released are rearrested within 8 years. So doesn't mean that nobody's being deterred, but you do have to ask the question, if the goal is keeping people from committing crimes, you have the same people many times committing the same or similar crimes once they come out. So they're not being deterred. Are others being deterred? And it's questionable whether when they're coming out, that period of incarceration is actually improving their lives at all, because when they come out, for whatever reason, many times they're going back and committing the same crimes or different crimes. So we really have to look at whether what we're doing to either punish or to address people who commit crimes, whether that's really working, whatever the goal is. And that's really important. One other thing we have to talk about, and this is something that I don't bring up lightly. When we talk about heaviness, we're really getting there now. Um, if we're going to talk about the criminal justice system, we have to talk about systemic racism and the question of whether there is systemic racism in the criminal justice system. And if you're watching this, you can tell. I personally have no experience with racism myself. However, the people that I work with and the people that I see when I go to court, I can see what's going on. And even aside from that, we can look at statistics and we can see that data shows that Black Americans are imprisoned at about 5 times the rate of white Americans in state prisons. And that pattern appears across socioeconomic groups. And that suggests there's something in the system shaping outcomes and not just individual choices. So, so we have to look at things and say, okay, this is what's happening. This is what the general population looks like. This is what the population looks like in our courtrooms and in the criminal in our prisons. And we just have to ask ourselves, is this proportionate? And I don't think the answer is just to say, oh, well, these people are just committing crimes at a higher rate, because the statistics don't show that either. And when we're talking about racism, we're talking about systemic racism, and so we're not necessarily talking about something that is intentionally nefarious. Now, trust me, racism in any way, shape, or form is obviously bad, and that's the whole point. But I think in many cases, it's not that people are necessarily looking to incarcerate people of color or arrest people of color. Sometimes maybe it's just easier because those are the people who, again, happen to be in the vicinity, happen to have a connection, happen to be in a situation where maybe these things seem like they're more likely to happen. So all I'm saying is I think we have to look at our overall population, and we have to look at the population in our courtrooms and in our prisons, and we have to ask ourselves, is this proportionate? And if it's not, why not? And what do we need to do about it? So ultimately, at the end of the day, we're talking about a system, but it's real people that are being affected. You've got families who are waiting for that breadwinner to come home. They're waiting for a parent to come home. They're waiting for a spouse to come home who is sitting in a prison cell. Do they deserve to be there? Sometimes, sometimes not. It's hard to say. But point being is they're there for whatever reason. And that takes a real toll on their family. If you commit a crime, if you're convicted of a crime, regardless of whether you actually did it or not, that's on your record and that stays with you. Now, fortunately, in some states, like my home state of North Carolina, we do have expungement laws that have actually been expanded recently, so that it is easier, even if you're convicted of a crime, it's easier to get that off your record at some point if you're able to, you don't commit the same type of crime again. You keep your record clean. But that still is a long process, and it's not a guarantee unless it's a dismissal. Even a dismissal stays on your record and has to be expunged. So even if you're arrested for something and you go to court and the case is dismissed, unless you actually go through the process of getting it expunged, it still shows up on your record, and you got to do something about that. So those are options, but some people, again, it usually takes, in many cases, it might take some legal help to get that done, and that's not something the state's going to pay for. So you've got to either figure out how to do that yourself or pay an attorney to do it. And if you're trying to get something off your record that maybe you didn't do to begin with, but you felt like you had to plead to, if you don't do that, then that's going to follow you, for, you're trying to get a job, if you're trying to apply for loans, schools, whatever. I mean, that criminal record is going to stay with you unless you're able to do something about it. And then many times, let's say you do something, you make a mistake, that becomes your identity. People that know you, especially if you happen to be high profile and people find out about it, you do something, and that just, regardless of whether you can get it off your actual record, that stays with you in the minds of people. Automatically, they just see, oh, that's the person that committed that crime. And that's all they see. And so that's real and that's heavy. And people get processed faster than sometimes the understanding. So that it's a heavy system, but sometimes and it can be it can be a system that doesn't move fast, but then when it does, it does. And so you can get swept up in something before you know it, all of a sudden, because of an accusation, you're stuck in a situation that you just can't get out of. And again, there are people who are arrested that deserve to be arrested. There are people convicted that deserve to be convicted. But what we're talking about here is just looking at the system overall and what it does to people. And that's the real human cost of what happens. So just like the stout, it lingers. It's comforting in a sense. So if you're not involved in it, you know, just like the stout, if you're not involved in the criminal justice system, you can look at it and say, okay, they're keeping me safe because they're keeping all these bad people off the street. But then the question becomes, are they all really bad people? Even the people that commit crimes, are they really bad people? Or are they people who do bad things? And I think that's a very, very distinct difference. And it's a distinction that we need to make. So some people can handle the weight, some people can't. And it just kind of crushes them, it crushes their families. And that's just the nature of the system. So sometimes justice can feel really, really heavy. And if it feels this heavy, then we need to ask ourselves why. And if there's something that we can do about it. So that's our look at the criminal justice system. Thank you so much for watching. Next time, we're going to lighten things up a little bit, and we're going to look at not only a lighter beer, but we're going to look at a much lighter subject. It's just as frustrating, but it won't be as heavy. We're going to talk about governmental bureaucracy and how it affects us, and bureaucracy in other places as well. So we'll hope you'll join us. Again, I'm Jonathan Nobles. Thank you for watching Beyond a Reasonable Stout, and we'll see you next time.